All right. Hi, everyone. Big thanks to everybody for listening in today and for also being a part of our High Growth Matters community. I'm Leanne Langer. I'm OpenComp's head of customer experience and really excited to join you today for today's Ask Me Anything. As you know, learning is super important as part of our High Growth Matters community because our goal is your compensation success, right? So we want to make sure that we're facilitating that learning as much as possible. And so today we are going to ask our expert, Alex Shaw, compensation consultant from OpenComp. We're going to ask him anything. Alex, do you want to say hi?
Hello, I'm Alex. I've been with OpenComp for just over a year now. I've worked in compensation for about 5 years. We're getting internal comp teams going through annual pay reviews, helping recruiting with making comp decisions, all the full shebang. So yeah, excited to get to talk about geo strategies here today.
Awesome. And I've had the pleasure of working directly with you, Alex, for the past 8 to 9 months. And Geopay as well as pay ranges has been a really important topic over the past period. And I know it's obviously not something that is going away anytime soon. So like Alex said, today's topic is setting pay ranges from a geodiversity perspective. And so we'll break this down into its individual components first. We'll start with a bit about pay ranges, then talk about Geopay, and then towards the end, we'll actually merge these two concepts together and talk about how they impact each other in their application. So let's get started with some basics. So Alex, when you price a job, what are the components that you absolutely need to calibrate in order to get to the right benchmark data?
Yeah, so whenever you're using market data, first thing you need to do is get your internal jobs aligned to how the market data is set. So that key components of that are going to be the job role. So if I'm a compensation analyst, find the match of compensation analyst in the market data. The job level, so the years of experience an employee has, what the expectations for that role is, and then the work location. So where is that employee located? And we'll get into cost of labor differentials, how different markets will pay same roles at a different rate, just by virtue of supply and demand.
Mm-hmm. So basically, we need to know what it is the employee does for their job, the job level or the competency in which they perform those job duties, as well as where in which they do that work.
Yep, exactly.
Cool. So we know also that not all benchmarks are created the same. So can you explain a bit about the difference between market price data versus this idea of aggregated pay ranges?
Yeah, so when we talk about market price data, that's when we're looking directly at raw market data. So like I mentioned, you find your benchmark role, your job level, and then a data provider will have those kind of roles aggregated. And when we're looking at market price data, we're looking directly at what the market is paying for that role. When we're talking about ranges, we're talking about sort of aggregating the jobs within our company, finding similar jobs, and then jobs that pay at a similar rate. We'll group those together, build ranges for those. So that's like an internal range structure that we're building, as opposed to going directly to the market. So it'll be more tailored towards what's relevant towards your individual company.
Mm-hmm. So then with the pay ranges, you actually start with market price data, and that kind of creates that foundation, right, for those individual jobs that you then group into these pay ranges of an aggregated data set, like you mentioned. So with that, properly calibrating the market pricing is really important because it's actually creating this foundation of our pay ranges. And presumably a company could leverage market pricing for quite a while. So do you have any best practices around what size of company or which stage a company would be at before they consider moving from market pricing to pay ranges?
Yeah, so I think, initially getting calibrated to the market data and market pricing for an early stage company is going to be really valuable. Where it's going to become more difficult to maintain that is as you start to grow and scale. You're sort of targeting you're targeting a moving target as the market data shifts, and you're going to find inconsistencies across your benchmarks and how you're targeting pay for your employees. One of the advantages with building ranges is you can build, you can decide we want to target the 50th percentile. So for all your range structures across your board, you're targeting the 50th percentile, and you can build a consistent spread around that target. And then that's much more helpful for managing. It's a lot easier as you grow to manage those ranges as opposed to managing to the direct market data, because you run into issues of what you're targeting, but when you have an employee paid above that target or below that target, how do you understand what's too far below and what's too far above? Whereas with ranges, you build that into the structure, so you have an understanding of when employees very high in the range, you feel like they're probably getting ready to be close to a promotion, or an employee's low in a range, maybe they're new to the role. It gives you these levers for really managing your pay to these ranges consistently across the board, as opposed to kind of always being stuck to whatever the market is saying.
Mm-hmm. So the pay ranges help give more balance, like you said, more stability and consistency across job families, and in terms of progression from one job level to the next. And when you have that consistency and that stability, it also empowers you from a fair pay perspective, right? So you can manage pay from both an external competitiveness and an internal pay equity perspective across your org.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I mentioned, with when you're targeting just market data, it's hard to know what distance from that wherever you're targeting is too much or is reasonable. Whereas you build that into your ranges, you have a good understanding of what it means for an employee to be at a certain position in the range, and it's a useful tool for then comparing employees who fall into the same range.
Mm-hmm. So when you do a pay range, you basically you choose a target. So what point in the range would be your target pay, or you can call that your midpoint, as you mentioned, and then you build the rest of your range off of that. So essentially creating like a minimum, a midpoint, and a maximum. So the employee, as they progress in their job competency in the role, they're also able to progress within that pay range in a consistent and stable manner.
Yeah, exactly.
So how would a company actually decide on how many pay range structures that they should implement?
So it's going to depend on where they're at as an organization and what their overall strategy is. But the approach we typically like to take is we'll group jobs by similar business functions. So you would have like your HR, your finance, your typical G&A roles, and then maybe you group together your tech roles, your software engineers, product managers, etc. And then we'll then build out structures based on, what's the market data telling us for these roles. So we can group together roles that are paid pretty similarly and fall in the same business categories, and then kind of build out structures from there. So we'll, it'll depend on, how many, where you're at as a company, how many different unique roles do you have, and what makes sense for you in terms of administration.
Is it fair to say that as your company grows in terms of stage or development, or in other words, like sophistication of the types of jobs that they're hiring team members in, that the pay range structures might shift as well?
Yeah, definitely. So, as you're adding new roles, and that's kind of one of the advantages of building ranges, is that when you have these new roles entering the company, you can just try to figure out how to slot them into your ranges, or, if need be, how to adjust that range, those existing ranges to, work for these new roles that are coming into your company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So it sounds like the most basic sort of range structure would be like technical versus non-technical positions. And then perhaps as the organization grows, you may see a further delineation between business versus tech versus product sorts of roles. Do you
And
see?
also, I just also mentioned there, just like you would have, you know, a separate structures for your sales org, because that's going to be the compensation for your sales team is going to be a lot different from the rest of your organization.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I typically haven't used pay ranges when pricing sales roles. What has been your best practice approach to the sales function?
So yeah, so our best practice approach is we'll essentially build if for the rest of the organization, we'll group job families whose pay is similar or, you know, fall into similar groups. With sales roles, you know, they're all different in their own way. So we'll typically, those ranges will be kind of unique to individual job families, because we'll see things like different types of sales roles will have different pay mixes when it comes to their base salary versus their commissions. And so to try to group together a bunch of different sales roles kind of ultimately doesn't make sense from a like a fair practices perspective.
Yeah, because there's a lot of nuances when it comes to that variable compensation component and how it affects total cash.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you see companies implementing more than 3 pay range structures? Like, is there a point where there's too many?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we'll definitely see more than 3, and that kind of comes into, you know, you say like your technical versus your non-technical and your sales, and then you would get into you have your technical role. You know, not all technical roles are the same or pay the same, and so you would build out like an A, B, and C of, you know, the most important jobs to your company or the hardest to fill roles. Those are going to be in your premier range, your A range, and then, you know, kind of, and this is where we use the market data. You know, jobs that don't, we'll sort of delineate that A, B, and C based on what the market data is telling us. So jobs 1 are grouped by that, you know, they fall into that tech category, but then what the market data is telling us with how much they're paid, we can then segment further on, you know, this is our premier range, this is the highest paying tech range we have, and the mid-tier tech range, and then our lowest paying tech range. Mm-hmm. And then applying that across, you know, your business functions and so on. Yeah.
It's a great call out. And I think it's really important, particularly, you know, with the competitive hiring environment that we have, but there are simply some jobs that command an additional premium, and that needs to be taken into consideration so that the pay ranges created don't dilute the targets, but instead support the actual competitiveness of the market that companies have to hire within.
Yeah, and it's important, you know, it's like you build a range structure to cover, you know, most of the jobs at your company, but every company is going to be different. They're going to have jobs that are more important to them, to their organization, than would be at another organization. And so you build this range as like your foundation, these ranges as your foundation, but, you know, there are going to be the exceptions. And then that's again where you can go back to the market data to make use of, do these ranges make sense for, you know, this particular role that is really important to us, or do we kind of need to treat this one as an exception and, you know, figure out a better way of managing this?
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a skill in how you combine that science, you know, that data, that logic with the art of compensation as well.
Yep.
So from your perspective, is managing comp using pay ranges more challenging than using market pricing, or is it, or does it simplify?
I'd say it simplifies the approach, because you have, based on the job family and based on the employee's job level, you sort of know exactly where they fall. And then when you go to hire, if you know exactly what the range is every time, versus when you're going to the market data, you maybe, again, it comes back to having that one data point with, you know, we're targeting the market, but how do you sort of move around that one point versus having an entire range to manage to? You know, gives you that minimum, gives you that maximum, and gives you that consistently across, you know, all jobs that you're hiring for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with pay ranges, you can also implement your compensation philosophy. So to your previous point around, your ranges being unique to your organization, to what you need to do in order to compete for the right talent to achieve your business objectives. I think that becomes really important as well. And I'm a super visual person, so I really like the pay ranges in terms of the visuals that they give me. So you see your compensation in a range from minimum to midpoint to maximum. And at the same time, you can also visualize the progression of the employee's development within that range from a job competency perspective. And it is actually a really cool visual to lend to employee career development and compensation development conversations, because, the two, so often pair very nicely hand in hand. So it's great to have that progression.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And that's where ranges really come into play with when we talk about like compensation transparency. If you're just sticking with market data, you can say, we target the 50th percentile. But again, once you get into those questions of how far above is too far above or how far below is like an acceptable amount, it's difficult to, provide that justification for why an employee is being paid what they're being paid. With ranges, you can build that guidance into, your different quartiles. So what does it mean what are the expectations for an employee? And what does it mean if they're paid in the lower half of the range or the lower quartile versus if they're around the midpoint or at the higher end of the range? You can kind of set those expectations with employees. You can, talk through what that stuff means. And then you can give them expectations for, what they'll need to do to move into that next range. And you'll know what that next range is, for when they're in a promotion, you give them an idea of what, where they could expect their pay to fall.
Yeah, I love that. So it's the context that you need to help manage your talent in a really holistic way, from compensation to performance to career development. Yeah, it's definitely a preferred method from my perspective. So let's segue a bit. Let's talk now about Geopay strategies. And like you said before, right, we can't talk about Geopay without clarifying what the difference is between cost of living versus cost of labor. Can you share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so cost of living comes down to, like the cost to maintain a certain standard of living within a geographic region. So it's based on like, goods and services at a region, housing or rent. What's that like housing market look like in an area? Cost of labor is determined by supply and demand of labor in a particular region. So what is the cost to hire and retain locals, and what is the cost of their knowledge, their skill set within a specific region? So you see that difference where you might have a very expensive place to live, but a certain type of job is not necessarily going to be in high demand there. So the cost of that labor isn't necessarily going to line up with the cost of living.
So this goes hand in hand with the idea of job calibration, like we talked about before.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it accurate to say that our benchmark data is reflective of cost of labor?
Yeah, that's how we assign our geo differentials, is based on cost of labor data.
Got it. So getting into Geopay more specifically, we commonly see 4 main Geopay strategies. And so I was hoping that we could dive into each and discuss what each strategy means, along with which types of organizations might be interested. And we can check them off one by one. Does that sound good?
Yeah, for sure.
All right, cool. So let's start with the strategy of individual employee locations.
Yeah, so this is a strategy you might use where you want to pay employees based on where they live, based on what market they're in, across the board. And and on one hand, that feels like it might be the most equitable. They're being paid to match the market that they're in. On the other hand, that is going to be about as difficult to administer as it gets, because you're going to have to understand the market for each individual region that your employees fall in. And so, especially we're approaching a post-pandemic society, maybe more and more of the workforce is going remote, or at least hybrid. And so we're seeing workforces kind of spread out across the country. And so that, yeah, individual employee locations is probably going to be one of the more difficult strategies to administer.
And an example would be like compensating based on zip code, right? Like getting as granular as that, like your exact work location. And to your point, as more and more of the workforce is distributed, it is a heavy administrative burden to be able to get that granular.
Yeah, and the reason a company might use a strategy like this is that they might have, again, the answer to every single question is going to be, it depends. Depending on like, what kind of roles they have, they might have jobs that they absolutely have to be in the location that they're at. And so in that sense, they want to compensate fairly. And so, if an employee happens to live in a more expensive market, you don't want to treat them as the same across the board as an employee who happens to live in a cheaper market, because then it's not fair to your employees when they have to live in that particular location.
And so I think maybe with our next strategy type, which is nearest office locations, I think that you can still get pretty granular with that, but create some consistency across, I guess, employees who would be able to commute within an office location, for example. Maybe this is more of like a pre-pandemic sort of example here, and we don't see it so much nowadays.
Yeah, and you might be seeing less, like companies have less offices across the country. And so this might be, this would be something with maybe like a hybrid, if you're taking like a hybrid approach to your workforce, is they don't necessarily live in that city, but we're treating them as what's their closest office. They're going to be there a few days a week. But if they live in the suburbs, we're not going to get so granular that so I'm in LA, so like somebody who lives in the valley is going to get paid differently than somebody who lives downtown when we're both working in the same office.
And you talked about LA, so if we go to our third strategy, the major metropolitan areas that are typically grouped by tiers. This is actually where we see the majority of organizations actually mapping their Geopay strategies to. So 55% of orgs based on a recent World at Work survey. So how would that approach work?
Yeah, so that would probably be, that's going to be pretty similar to like your nearest office locations, just with the caveat that you might only have one office, but especially with the pandemic, we have workforce that's spread out across the country. And so again, keeping it, simplifying your approach so that it's not, what particular city do you live in, what zip code do you live in, but like, what's the nearest major metro area? And so, the advantage of that is it does simplify your approach as opposed to, getting as granular as individual locations. And so, that'll help with, that again comes back to like that transparency and communicating to your employees, why they're being paid what they're being paid. And so I guess to just elaborate on this approach a little bit, you might have, you have employees all over the country. And so you're not necessarily even paying like every single major metro area has its own rate. You might say, here's our premier markets, we're going to pay these at one rate. Here's our mid-tier markets, we'll pay them at another. So you might develop like 3 or 4 different geo tiers and just apply those across the board. And so you can see the big advantage of that is it's a lot easier to understand and it's a lot easier to apply. You just need to know where a location, what tier falls into, and then how to apply your approach.
And how do those tiers get created? Is there like pay differentials that you can get from your benchmark data source that will help you group major metropolitan areas or cities into similar cost of labor, groups or tiers?
Yeah. So again, it's like, so OpenComp has cost of labor differential data. And so that's how we'll group major metropolitan areas. You can make use of that data, or if it's, again, coming back to, an individual company might have particular markets that are very important to them because of the nature of the industry that they're in. And so you might take, a unique approach with how you set up those tiers. But yeah, to answer your question, it can come from the benchmarking data that we have.
Got it. And then if we go to our fourth strategy, we have pay based on a national rate or a headquarters rate. Can we talk about that one a bit?
Yeah, so this might come in where you decide you have a workforce that's spread out across the country, and so to keep things fair and simple, you just say we're targeting the national average, and we're applying that across the board. So obviously that's going to be the easiest to administer because you don't have to worry about where employees are. The disadvantages you run into is you might be coming up short for difficult to hire roles, or in your more expensive markets. So we talked about the other approaches like targeting where your headquarters is, and so this you might sort of run into a similar problem in an opposite way. Like your headquarters in San Francisco, and you decide you're going to pay San Francisco rates across the board. You might have a lot of jobs that you're more or less overpaying for. That if you hired at a more local rate, or even closer to a national average, you'd be able to hire employees at that rate, but you're spending San Francisco rates, or wherever your headquarters is.
Mm-hmm. And we see about 38% of organizations that actually leverage this national rate or headquarter rate. And so this actually comes up a lot in conversations, but the hiring market is already super competitive. So how do companies compete with organizations that are using this national or headquarters rate? And what sort of impact are you seeing when it comes to value prop and candidate offers?
Yeah, and so that's where it comes back to like your company strategy, and what's the nature of your industry, and what are the valuable roles at your company? What are your hard to fill roles, and what are really sort of the important roles to your company's success? That's where you kind of can get into a more nuanced strategy of like, yes, we're gonna target at a national rate across the board, but for these roles that we know we need to get the best candidates here, let's target the most expensive market, or let's target a higher percentile for these roles. And so that's where you can try to compete. And you don't need to necessarily try to compete across the board, but for where it matters most to you.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's also where that value prop comes in. The compensation is the number one concern of employees right now, but even top pay cannot completely band-aid other shortcomings that exist in an organization. So if there's like a lack of career development opportunities, for whatever reason, a lack of trust, maybe in the leadership team or in, the future of the organization, poor company culture, for example, there's these other pieces, that need to be addressed as well. And having a really solid value proposition, helps position your organization as a place where candidates, will want to come and work.
Yeah, and it's a good point, and it's important to remember that like employees value their compensation, but if they value equally, if not more so, understanding why they're being paid what they're being paid. Mm-hmm. So if we can, coming back to the ranges or your geo strategy, the important thing is to establish a strategy and an approach, and to apply it consistently, and be able to have that as something you can communicate. So, whether or not an employee is happy with what they're being paid, if you can help them understand why you've reached that decision, it'll definitely go a long way.
Yes, transparency for sure. All right, we're getting super close on time, so I'm going to blast through some of these other questions. Is Geopay managed the same across all roles?
So that's another nuance there is that you might not apply, and like what I just mentioned, you might not apply the same strategy across all roles. So one thing we'll see is like executive roles will typically we won't apply a geo differential to, or sales roles, because if they're selling all across the country, their location is not going to be important, and so we're not going to pay differently for different markets there. And then again, coming back to, you have your difficult to fill roles or your vital roles to your company. You want to essentially target what it's going to take to bring in the best talent. And so you might, again, and that just comes back to as long as you're consistent with that approach, you know, you don't have to apply the same differential across the board.
And the same would apply for field sales roles as well, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then similarly, is Geopay managed the same across different job levels?
So this might be something, again, to the same answer as always, it depends. Like I mentioned with like executive roles, we typically don't see like a geo differential applied, depending on where the employee is at. And then you might see different strategies with like, maybe at your individual contributor level, you'll apply a differential, but when people move into, you know, upper levels of management, you could then decide, depending on the nature of the company, it doesn't matter where this employee is at, or they're managing a large region, and so we're not going to apply a differential.
I think it also goes back to what you said before, like the premier jobs, right? So like the more skills an employee has, the more value they bring to the organization, you know, and oftentimes the more money that that skill set actually commands.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so we laid the groundwork for pay ranges. We also touched on Geopay strategy. So let's bring these two together. How do you apply your Geopay strategy to your pay ranges?
So you would build your ranges, you know, based on, you could build your ranges based on, you know, one set of market, so one market, and then you would, if you set up a tiered approach, or, you know, depending on what your geo strategy approach is, and then just like apply a geographic differential to those ranges, so that you're, depending on where an employee is, you have that range structure. It's that same structure, but now we're shifting the target based on what their market is. So that midpoint is going to be shifted based on that employee's location.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess to give an example, if, you know, in our range structure, the midpoint is 100K, and the employee works in a market where we decided it's, you know, it's paying like an 85% differential, that midpoint is then going to be at 85K.
Mm-hmm. So you basically take the percentage differentials that you set up in your Geopay tier, and you can simply apply that to your pay range to create the adjustment for the location.
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't seem too hard. With that, I'm sure there's common mistakes that you see with Geopay and pay ranges. What can you share with us?
Yeah, and so I think, you know, we've kind of touched on some of this stuff, in that, like, if you're using the wrong differential, or you're using the wrong approach, you might run into a situation where you have employees who are being underpaid, and so you might run into issues that come with that, where turnover, or having a hard time hiring people. And then sort of on the opposite end of the thing, you might be overpaying a lot of your employees, or you're targeting too high, and so it's you know, not financially prudent from a company perspective. You're paying too much for a talent that you could get for a you know, a cheaper rate.
And if you could give one recommendation that would help change the game, you know, regarding Geopay or pay ranges for our community here, what would that best practice or recommendation be?
I think it's just important to you know, develop an approach, whatever it might be, and apply it, so that you can have this consistent strategy. You know, you have this strategy that you can fall back on, and then you can start to communicate that. And even if it's, you know, you ultimately need to see how it works and see how it goes, and, you know, adjust. But it's definitely, it's not something you should like wait on to develop and apply. It's really important, especially we see how, you know, the workforce is becoming more and more remote, or, you know, more hybrid at least. And so it's definitely something you're going to have to address at one time or another.
Mm-hmm. So set that philosophy, test your philosophy, and know that your philosophy needs to evolve just the way your organization is going to continue to evolve, grow, and scale over time.
Yeah. And I just say, like, I guess, like, in summary, and talking about this stuff with your geo strategy and building your ranges, is that, you know, you're not going to make all your comp decisions just based on this foundation you've laid, but this is giving you the foundation to make those comp decisions. So there's always going to be, you're going to have your top performers, you're going to have exceptions, you're going to have specific roles to your company that don't necessarily fit in. that you'll have to manage, but this is all this stuff helps to give you that foundation to operate off of and to be much better equipped to handle those tricky situations that come up.
This was awesome, Alex. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, this is fun.
Will you come back one day?
Yeah, of course.
All right. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week.